Okay, so a couple things before we get started, right? So we are coming up on midterm, which means that that first paper is going to be coming due within the next couple weeks, right? So the proposal portion of the paper is going to be due tomorrow night. So we'll talk about what this means in a minute, right? We'll talk about the whole paper assignment, what that's going to look like, and how the proposal fits into it. But for Tuesday, you're going to be reading the two poems in the anthology from Alfred Lord Tennyson's Idylls of the King. So these are poems about, or they're based on the Arthur legend, the coming of Arthur and the departure of Arthur. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what this paper is going to look like and what the expectations are before we get into anything else. Come on, there we go. I realize that I have to re-upload the paper assignment because it seems like the version that went onto Georgia View is the one with the track changes not turned off. So I fixed that for this, but we'll have to upload a new version probably this afternoon. Okay, so what you're going to be doing is writing a 1,000 to 1,500 word argument based on a close reading of a single text, right? So any text that we have read up to this point is fair game. But remember that you're only writing about one text. Even if you're choosing something from one of those like movement clusters that we talked about, like you choose something from the slavery cluster or the Gothic cluster or the Orientalism cluster, remember that you're choosing one text to write about. Yes, Alex?
We're still able to connect it to the broader themes though, right?
Yes, I want you to connect it to broader course themes, yes. That's part of the assignment. So you are providing an interpretation of your chosen text, but it must be a focused interpretation that relates to a single important theme or idea. So one of the things you might consider doing is expanding on one of your response papers as a starting point, right? So there's a response paper that you like and you did well on, right? It's probably not a bad idea to sort of flesh that out a little bit, right? Maybe try to further flesh out the pattern you noticed in that response paper and build an argument on that. So the first part of this is going to be this 250-word proposal, which will be due tomorrow night. That's what you'll be doing this week instead of a response paper. The second part will be the complete paper. So I don't require you to submit a draft for this assignment, but I encourage you to give me a draft, right? There are two reasons for this. One, if you're writing a draft, it means you're getting started early, right? You're getting ahead of the game. And you're not going to be sitting up late at night the day before the assignment's due, like oh shit, I got to finish this, right? The other reason I want to see a draft is that then I can give you feedback and make sure that your ideas are coming together, right? Before you actually submit the paper. And I do also give extra credit if you go to the Writing Center for this. So at any stage of the assignment, if you go to the Writing Center and they send me back an email that says, Valencia was here and we talked about blah, you will get half a letter grade's extra credit. So the purpose of this assignment is to develop your own original interpretation of the course text that is rooted in evidence, right? And to construct a sustained argument supporting your interpretation with evidence. So, basic formal requirements. So it has to be Times New Roman font, 12-point type, right? So same as the response papers. And the reason I require this simply is because it's what's easiest to read. You need to double space all submissions. Also, do not use secondary sources for this assignment, right? All of the ideas here should be your own. We're going to be doing a research paper at the end of the semester. You'll use secondary sources for that. But for this one, I just want to see how well you are understanding course themes and how well you are able to connect them to particular works of literature, right? Citations of your primary source should be in standard MLA format with parenthetical notation for in-text citations and a works cited page. So if you don't know how to do an MLA Works Cited page, that's fine. I will send you a link that will explain it to you and give you a template. And make sure that when you follow that template, what you are doing is looking at the works in the anthology for template, right? So I don't want you to cite the whole anthology as your source. I want you to cite the particular text you're talking about. So for example, if you are writing about Oluda Equiano, I want you to cite Equiano and not Stephen Greenblatt, the editor, right? Make sense? Any questions so far? Okay, so as for the proposal, so the proposal must be at least 250 words long and no longer than 300, right? One thing to remember as we are doing all of these writing assignments is that longer isn't necessarily better. If you're going outside the length parameters for the assignment, then you're probably trying to bite off something too big. You'll provide your working thesis, right? So you're going to give me the basic argument you're starting with, and a brief description of what you intend to do to advance this thesis in the longer paper. So, things to keep in mind here. First off, you're merely describing your arguments in the proposal, right? You're not trying to make the case yet. So this is just a preview of what you're doing in the final paper. Your proposal should include the following elements. First, a statement of the question you are trying to answer or the problem you're trying to solve. Second, your current working thesis, which is your proposed answer to this question. And third, the most important background information your reader will need to understand your argument. So is this clear to everybody what you need to do, what you need to include here? Okay, so the paper itself, as I said, is going to be 1,000 to 1,500 words. And what you're going to be doing here is what we call close reading, right? So this is reading a text with close attention to detail and to nuances of meaning. So the first thing you're going to want to make sure you do is choose quotes that you think point to some bigger issue or idea in the text and that add up to some kind of pattern. Start with close attention to particular words and sentences, right? Pay attention to the literal and implied meanings of words, right? So not just what a word literally means, but also the kind of associations we have with a particular word, right? So if we take a word like rose, right? What literally is a rose?
Flower.
Yeah, it's a flowering plant with thorns on the stem, right? And usually red leaves, right? But what kind of ideas do we associate with a rose?
Beauty.
Yeah. Right, beauty, right, romance, sexuality, even danger because of the thorns, right? So what these are the connotations of the word rose, right? These outside ideas that we associate with that particular word or image. So these are the kind of things you're going to want to think about as you're trying to pull out your interpretations here, right? As you're looking at specific words. You're also going to want to try to be aware of multiple meanings of specific words, right? In some cases, writers are going to be playing on ambiguity, and make sure that you are paying attention to that, and look for potentially meaningful images and symbols, right? And all of this is then going to lead you to try to put together patterns, right? Things that repeat throughout the text, right? Lines or words that are connected through rhyme or through alliteration. How does the text establish a relationship between the narrator or speaker and the reader or hearer, right? These are all questions you might want to try to focus on. And then you put the pattern together, right? How do these details add up to a singular theme, right? How can the meanings of ambiguous words be resolved? What potentially contradictory ideas does the text hold in tension with one another? And how does the way the text is put together help us to make meaning of it or hinder us from making meaning, right? We've seen a couple of cases, right, where the text seems to deliberately throw roadblocks in our way that make it hard to draw a particular meaning or message from it, right? So if we look, for example, at the end of the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, right? events at the end of the poem seem to contradict the mariner's apparent message, right? So these are the kinds of moments, right, that you might want to focus on, that might be worth further analysis. And finally, remember that you need to contextualize the text you're reading of it, right? So we're not relating these texts to the author's personal lives, right? How much discussion of author biography have we done in this class? Not much, right? Because, one thing, about sort of the method that I use for interpretation anyway, right? Like part of the mantra here is like, I don't give a shit about the author's life. Right? Even when we've looked at autobiographies, we've talked about more how they fit into intellectual and historical currents, right? So that's the kind of thing that I'm more interested in. That's the kind of thing that I think is actually kind of more revealing of how these texts are placed historically. And that's the kind of thing that we're really talking about here in this class. So the questions you'll want to be thinking about then, right, I have listed out here, right? How does the text incorporate or respond to specific historical events? What specific historical trends and literary, philosophical, or cultural influences inform this text, and how? What stance does the text seem to adopt towards its historical moment, right? Is it critical? Is it celebratory? Is it satirical? Right? Is it looking backward on the past? That sort of thing, right? How do you think this text might have been received by audiences in its own time? We've talked a lot about this with these gift book submissions, right? How would the text's form and circumstances of publication have influenced the readership it reached? Can you connect this text to others that we've read in this course? And finally, I think I've said something like this before, but I swear that if I read the phrases back in the day or in today's society in another student paper in my lifetime, I'm going to lose my shit, right? And let me just explain why I dislike these phrases, right? I think we may have covered this at the beginning of class, but it's worth revisiting. When you say back in the day, you are treating history as though it's just this great big jumble of events that happened in no particular order before you were born. And that it doesn't really matter all that, like that the past is all the same, right? When in fact, one of the things that we're looking at here is that the past actually like moves in distinct eras and movements, right? That are quite different from each other. Like as we start to talk about the Victorian age today, we'll see that the values of writers in the Victorian age and their approach to their own culture is very different from what we saw in the Romantic age, right? The subject matter isn't always different, but they're treating it in a very different way. So the problem within today's society is this notion that everything has to relate to something that we're familiar with today, right? And what I want you to try to do is instead understand the work on its own terms and its own time, right? So does this make sense to everybody? Is anybody confused about anything? Does anybody have any questions? Okay, you got plenty of time to ask me questions if they come up, right? If you have any issues, yeah, Valencia, go ahead.
Is this going to be on your?
This is on Georgia, yeah, it's in the assignments folder, yeah. I have to fix it because, like I said, I accidentally uploaded the track changes version. But yeah, so I will adjust that this afternoon. But yeah, all of this can be referenced on Georgia View, right? Okay, so I have a grading rubric posted at the end of this as well, right? And as always, right, you have to meet the requirements for a D to get a C, and the requirements for a C to get a B, and so on and so forth. This is all cumulative, right? So this is what you have to do to meet particular grade standards, right? All you have to do to get a D, like basic lowest passing grade, is meet the basic formal requirements and not plagiarize, right? As long as it's long enough and you get the formatting right, you get a D. If it's not long enough, if the formatting's screwy, you'll get some points, but it will be an F, right? A C directly addresses the actual assignment, right? You're actually trying to answer the assignment question. You demonstrate that you understand your primary source, your sources are properly cited, and you advance a clear thesis. It doesn't have to be a very good or complex thesis to get a C, but there does have to be a thesis, or there has to be an argument. For a B paper, you have to be making an argument that is clear, consistent, and arranged effectively. You have to be quoting your primary source directly. Remember that in the humanities, direct quotation is the norm, right? So in an English class or in a history class, you are generally going to be expected to quote directly rather than summarize or paraphrase. A B paper does not treat opinion as fact, and you make transitions between paragraphs clearly and effectively. So, topic sentence at the beginning that explains the basic argument of this paragraph, and then a sentence at the end that connects what you're doing in this paragraph to what you're doing in the next paragraph, right? For an A paper, you are giving an argument that is not just clear and consistent, but that is original and nuanced, right? That shows, genuine complexity and subtlety of thought. You include evidence that contradicts or complicates your argument and deal with it effectively. You achieve balance between argument and evidence, right? So each paragraph should deal with one main idea, right? One major claim and one piece of evidence to support that claim, and then an explanation as to how you got that claim from that evidence, right? That should be the basic structure of your paragraph. Argument is properly contextualized and free of glaring historical errors, and follows a single line of argument to its conclusion without digressions, right? So those are the standards for an A. Okay, so any questions about grading standards or anything else about the paper at all that has occurred to you as we have talking about this? Yeah, Alex.
What is without digression?
Okay, so digressions are little detours, right? Side trips, right? So avoiding digressions means kind of like making sure everything in the paper advances your main point, right? There's no filler. Anything else? Okay. As I said, if you have trouble while you're working and you have questions, then please just do get in touch with me. I'm happy to work with you. But let's then move on to talking about Thomas Carlyle and early Victorianism. So, if we think back on the Romantic literature that we've been reading the last couple of weeks, do the Romantics tend to focus more on the individual or on society? What are they more interested in?
I think society.
Why would you say society?
Because a lot of times in romantics, you hear a lot about different people and not just.
Think about that basic model for romantic poetry we discussed when we talked about Wordsworth, right? That greater romantic lyric. Right? What is that all about? What is the primary subject of most romantic poetry? If we think back to something like Tintern Abbey, is that poem actually about the abbey or about the landscape? Yeah, it's about Wordsworth's own thought process, right? So the primary subject of romantic poetry really is individual thought, right? And the workings of the individual mind. So in general, this isn't always the case, but in general, romantic poetry tends to be subjective and concerned with the individual, right? It tends to be inward focused, right? Even a poem like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a more sort of conventional narrative, right? It focuses primarily on the mariner's alienation from society and inability to reintegrate into it, right? So yeah, the focus of romantic poetry tends to be the individual. The Victorians, on the other hand, tend to be more objective in their work and their interests, and by objective we mean interested in things outside the self, right? Their primary focus is generally going to be things that are not my own consciousness, right? And yeah, they're much more interested in society, typically, than they are in the individual. Now, Carlyle is, in some ways, the earliest of the Victorians. He's a kind of pre-Victorian Victorian. And as such, he's still in a kind of a dialogue with Romanticism in a work like Sartor Resartus. But when we talk about the Victorian era, right, we're talking about the years between 1840 and 1901. Right? Queen Victoria sat on the throne for 61 years. So she oversees the British Empire for the entire latter half of the 19th century. Now, Carlyle is the same age as the youngest of the Romantics. He's born in the same year as Keats, but Keats got started young and died young. Right? Keats was dead by the age of 26. Carlyle didn't even really get started as a writer until he was in his 30s. So even though most of his important works belong to the 1830s, before Victoria actually takes the throne, he's usually classed with the Victorians because he is a kind of bridge figure between the two, right? He doesn't write like a romantic, and in fact, he's often kind of like both implicitly and explicitly critical of certain aspects of Romanticism. Now, I'm going to guess that Sartor Resartus gave you guys some trouble, right? This was one of the reasons I didn't give you guys a quiz on this, is because I knew it was going to be hard, right?
I was looking for it, and I was like, maybe
Uh-huh.
you got one.
Yeah, well, I tell you to look on Mondays and Wednesdays anyway because I want you guys to get into the habit of doing that, right? So if one doesn't pop up by 8 p.m., then you know you're not going to have one, right? But I want you guys to always check. So yeah, there was no quiz this week, right? That doesn't mean there won't be two next week, right? So just make sure that you always check on Monday and Wednesday to see whether or not there's a quiz. Yeah, okay, so what was it that gave you trouble? Was it the language again that mostly got in the way? Okay, and another thing that makes this a little difficult is that it's also an excerpt kind of taken out of context from a longer work, right? And it doesn't necessarily, the introduction it gives you kind of tries to place you with what's happening in the narrative here, but it does kind of an iffy job, right? So let's talk a little bit about what Sartor Resartus is and what the ideas are that are animating it, right? So what we've got here is something that's kind of a novel and kind of a philosophical treatise, right? It kind of bridges the gap between those two. It is a fictional narrative, but it is also a fictional narrative that is intended to advance a particular philosophical viewpoint. And it's a narrative on two levels, right? There's a frame story, which is narrated by an editor. The editor is never named, he's just the editor. And this editor has received this manuscript of these kind of just like disconnected leaves of paper in a bunch of paper bags. Like somebody just kind of left them on his doorstep. And this This manuscript was composed by an obscure German professor by the name of Diogenes Teufelsdruck. Diogenes is Greek for God-born. And Teufelsdruck is German for devil's shit. So, the character who is narrating all of the parts in quotation marks is a German philosopher by the name of God-born devil shit. So we can already tell there's some kind of satirical purpose at work here, right? And what the editor is trying to do is piece together Teufelsdruck's manuscripts in a way that makes sense. So this is one of the things that makes this confusing to read, right? It's that the editor himself, who is trying to relate this story to you, is dealing with something that is, by its very nature, fragmentary and confused and disconnected. And he's trying to stitch it together. Hence the title, and the title Sartor Resartus is Latin for the tailor retailored. And like a lot of things to do with this particular text, this also has a double meaning, right? On the one hand, it refers to Teufelsdruck's clothes philosophy, which we'll discuss in more detail in a minute. But it also refers to the process by which the editor is trying to stitch together Teufelsdruck's disconnected ramblings into some kind of coherent narrative and coherent philosophy, right? So what we have here is it's a kind of early experimental novel, right? Carlyle is experimenting here with form. He's refusing to give you a straightforward narrative. So were you guys at least able to determine that there were two different voices talking here? Okay, so
I don't know that.
okay, now you do, right? So, in general, the parts that are not in quotes are the editor. The parts that are in quotes are Teufelsdruck. So, as Teufelsdruck expounds his philosophy and tells his life story, right? The editor sometimes steps in to make comments on it and to talk about like little gaps in the narrative and places where he's confused about what Teufelsdruck is trying to say, right? So, excuse me. Let's look at the first couple paragraphs of this and see if we can already pull out a kind of basic theme here, thrust, right? Look on page 34. Under the strange nebulous development wherein our professor has now shrouded himself, no doubt but his spiritual nature is nevertheless progressive and growing. For how can the Son of Time in any case stand still? We behold him through those dim years in a state of crisis, of transition, his mad pilgrimings and general solution into aimless discontinuity. What is all this but a mad fermentation, wherefrom the fiercer it is, the clearer product will one day evolve itself. So this is confusing, right? Especially since you've just been thrown into this particular world. This is the editor speaking. But there are a couple of key terms here that are kind of important to keep in mind. One being the editor's use of the word shrouded. Right? That the professor has shrouded himself. This is a reference to the philosophy of clothes that Teufelsdruck is going to explain slightly later in the narrative. And indeed, we're going to see a lot of references here to clothing and to covering, right? The other thing is the chemical metaphor at the end of this. Right? It talks about fermentation and distilling. We find chemical metaphors all over this narrative, right? Whereby, something is purified by being fermented or boiled or whatever, right? So the idea that you're kind of taking an impure substance and making something better out of it, right? And this is actually something that does harken back to Romanticism. The Romantics were also fond of chemical metaphors. Coleridge, in his definition of the imagination, argued that the imagination takes two different things and dissolves them into something new, right? Right, so you've got, in Coleridge's definition of the imagination, the union of different ideas and impressions through dissolving and reforming, right? Rather than simply rearranging. So he's playing here with an idea that the Romantics were fond of. Such transitions are ever full of pain. Thus the eagle, when he molts, is sickly, and to attain his new beak, must harshly dash off the old one upon the rocks. So this is another clothes philosophy reference here. It might be worth kind of trying to pull out here what the basics of this clothes philosophy are here now. So were any of you able to figure out what's going on with the clothes philosophy? Did any of you understand this? It's okay if you didn't. I get it. Like, this is a difficult read. Okay. So here's how the philosophy of clothes works, right? So the basic idea that Carlyle expounds here is that religions and philosophies are like suits of clothes. What happens to your clothes if you wear them for too long? Yeah, they start to fade and wear out, right? So what this really is in a lot of ways is a philosophy of renewal, right? Right? Old clothes don't fit anymore. They fade, they fall apart, right? And they need to be replaced with something else. So what Carlyle is talking about here is what he sees as the decline of conventional Christianity in the 19th century. That it no longer suits the needs of the modern person. And it needs to be replaced with some other system that is that fits the modern body a little better, right? So this particular suit of clothes is worn out, and we need a new one. And what he's trying to figure out here is what that new one is going to be, right? So does this make sense, everybody? Everybody got this? So when he talks about like God and Godhead, he's not really talking about the Judeo-Christian God. When he talks about Godhead, what he's talking about instead is the general presence of the divine. And Carlyle subscribed to a philosophical notion that is now regarded as slightly batshit crazy, called vitalism. So a vitalist believes that the presence of energy in the world is evidence of divinity, right? Not of any specific divine being, right? So when he talks about Godhead, he's not talking about a particular deity, right? He's not talking about any specific God. He's just talking about this God stuff that he thinks exists in the world in the form of energy. And so a big part of Carlyle's purpose here is to try to find ways to channel this energy, get people to channel this energy, right? So how many of you are familiar with the Greek myth of Prometheus? I chose this particular piece of music at the beginning class for a reason. Yeah, so what do you guys know about Prometheus? Who is Prometheus?
Wasn't he the young? He was the young boy on. Was it him that was on Germany?
You might be thinking of Oedipus, the guy who accidentally killed his father and married his mother. Okay, yeah, that's different figure from Greek, similar name, but different figure from Greek mythology. What were you thinking, Jesse?
I was thinking about a god that had like the chariot with like the horses on it, but I'm not sure which one that is. I don't know.
Okay, I think you're probably thinking of like the way the ancient Greeks and Romans could have imagined the sun, right? The sun was called Helios by the Greeks and Sol by the Romans. And yet both of them imagined as basically a charioteer driving a team of horses across the sky. Okay, so Prometheus is a figure, he's a kind of semi-divine figure. So a kind of mediator between human beings and the gods, who stole fire from the gods to give it to human beings, and is then punished for eternity by the gods. He's chained to a mountain, and every morning an eagle comes and tears out his liver. And because he's immortal, he can't die. His liver is just going to regrow, and it's just the eagle is going to come back every morning and tear it out, right? But so Prometheus becomes a really important figure for the younger generation of romantics because he risks everything to bring this secret, right, this secret knowledge to human beings to better their lives. And Carlyle is reading the figure slightly differently. Not so much as a figure of rebellion, so like giving the gods the middle finger, but as this kind of prototype of the divine worker. Right? This kind of divine spark that makes all work possible. What he brings to human beings is energy, right? Fire is energy. And the way that human beings approach the divine is through harnessing and channeling energy in productive ways. Now, this is related to, but also critical of, a popular 19th century philosophical system called utilitarianism. We have not discussed utilitarianism yet, right? Okay, good. So utilitarianism comes to be the dominant school of thought in Britain as the middle class becomes more powerful and starts taking over government institutions, and as capitalism really kind of takes hold in Victorian Britain. Have any of you ever heard of utilitarianism before? Is this term familiar to anybody? Okay, Alex, you're nodding. You've heard of this?
I don't exactly remember what it is, but I do remember hearing about it, like history.
Okay. So yeah, so the primary exponents of this theory are Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, and James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill. And the basic tenet of utilitarianism is that an idea should be judged by its usefulness. And their definition of usefulness is highly specific. That which is useful is that which produces pleasure and reduces pain. So things that produce a lot of pain are useful, things that produce a lot of pleasure without producing pain are useful, right? And so, for a utilitarian, the goal is to maximize pleasure in the population at large, make as many people happy as possible, while also making sure that there's as little pain as possible. Which sounds okay, right? But the problem that a lot of people have with utilitarianism is how they try to do this, right? So they sort of treat human beings like they're machines. Like we are basically just kind of simple bundles of appetite. Bentham, for example, believed that human beings are motivated entirely by desire for reward and fear of punishment. That that's all we want. There's nothing more complex about us than that. And he even designed a model prison that was based on this principle called the panopticon. And the way a panopticon worked, there's a central tower from which a watcher could see into all of the cells that were around him in a circle. But the prisoners in the cells couldn't see the watcher. So they never knew whether they were being observed or not. But because they could be observed at any time, right, they knew that if they're caught breaking the rules, they're going to be punished. So Bentham theorized that that fear of punishment would reform the prisoner's behavior, and that they could then be sort of let back out into society, right? Only one of these was ever built. It's in Dublin. It's the newer wing of what's called Kilmainham Jail. Yeah, so there is one of these in existence, but this is not an idea that took off, right? But the basic principle here, again, is that human beings we want to be rewarded and we don't want to be punished. And so, utilitarians believe that the levers for moving human behavior are very, very simple, right? If you just give people enough to eat and don't oppress them too much, then everybody will be happy, right? So we get some idea of Carlyle's opinion of this if we look on page 35 when he talks about profit and loss philosophy. Can I get somebody to try to read that second long paragraph there, starting with "Alas, shut out from hope"?
Alas, shut out
Thank you,
from hope,
Monsieur.
in the deeper sense that we yet dream of, for as he wanders wearisome through the world, he has now lost all tidings of another empire, full of religion, or at least of religiosity, as our friend that since it exhibit himself. He hides not that in those days he was wholly irreligious, doubt and darkened to unbelief. Says he, shade after shade goes grimly over your soul till you have the fixed, starless
Tartarian. So the Tartarus is the hell part of the ancient Greek underworld.
The Tartarian blood.
Mm-hmm.
To such readers as have reflected what can be called reflecting on man's life and happily discovered in contradiction to much profit and loss philosophy. Speculative and practical thought soul is not synonymous with stomach. Who understands, therefore, in a friend's words, that for man's well-being, faith is properly the one thing needful? How with martyrs, otherwise weak, can cheerfully endure the shame and the cross, and without it, worldlings puke up their sick existence by suicide in the midst of luxury. To such it would be clear that for a pure moral nature, the loss of his religious belief was the loss of everything.
Okay, you can stop there for now, right? So when he talks about profit and loss philosophy, what he means is utilitarianism, right? And the way he sums this up is the idea that soul is synonymous with stomach, right? That the highest goal of human life is simply to be reasonably well fed, right? And the bit that he sort of tacks on there about the martyrs, right? You know, people who are able to endure all sorts of torments for the sake of an idea, demonstrates that there are higher things that human beings can aspire to, right? That soul is not, in fact, synonymous with stomach, that they're not the same thing. And that this is what he thinks the utilitarians are kind of leaving out of their calculations, right? By treating the human person as a machine. Right? He calls them wordmongers and motive grinders a little bit later on, right? Now, this argument is divided into three parts, right? So there are three sections here. That are labeled the everlasting no. The center of indifference. And the everlasting yea. So the idea here is to try to demonstrate Teufelsdruck's spiritual progress through a series of stages, right? So the everlasting no, which he expresses on page 39, in the midst of his despair. Right. Thus had the everlasting no, das ewige Nein, pealed authoritatively through all the recesses of my being, of my me. And then it was that my whole me stood up in native God-created majesty, and with emphasis recorded its protest. Such a protest, the most important transaction in life, may be that same indignation and defiance in a psychological point of view be fitly called. The everlasting no had said, behold, thou art fatherless, outcast, and the universe is mine, the devil's. To which my whole me now made answer, I am not thine, but free, and forever hate thee. So the everlasting no is spoken not by Teufelsdruck, right? But by these outside forces that are trying to make him feel weak and powerless and alienated, right? He overcomes these by voicing his protest, right? Essentially by asserting his individuality. Right, so this is stage one of his spiritual recovery, right? His stitching back the suit of clothes that's worn out. Now, the center of indifference is described on page 46. In that, towards the end of that long paragraph at the beginning, right? Pshaw, what is this paltry little dog cage of an earth? What art thou that sittest whining there? Thou art still nothing, nobody true, but who then is something? Somebody? For thee the family of man has no use, it rejects thee, thou art wholly as a dissevered limb, so be it, perhaps it is better so. So the center of indifference seems to be a kind of acceptance of alienation. Right, okay, yes, I am an individual, but I am an individual cut off from other individuals. What am I going to do about it? And this everlasting yea, with which he ends, is a re-engagement with humanity. And this re-engagement occurs through work. In fact, one of the ideas that's most associated with Thomas Carlyle comes to be called the gospel of work or the gospel of labor. Right? This philosophy with which he replaces the old Judeo-Christian philosophy, right? This new suit of clothes he stitches for himself is the idea that the purpose of life is to engage in meaningful work, right? To find the work that you are suited for and channel the divine energy that flows through you into that work. Right? That is what is important. That is what life is all about. If you feel dissatisfied, if you feel alone and alienated, right? Get to work. All work has dignity, all work has meaning, whether it's intellectual work or physical labor. So find what you are best suited for and channel your energy into it. And that's one of the reasons why Prometheus is a kind of interesting figure is an important figure for Carlyle, right? Because he's thinking of the Promethean figure as that deliverer of energy to you, not to protest, but to help you work. Right? You need that fire, you need that spark in order to work. And even before Teufelsdruck reaches this conclusion, we see that he's very much concerned with useful work and with not wasting energy. So to give you an example of how this works, can we turn to page 41 and 42? We're going to look at sort of Teufelsdruck's comments here on war, which, if we think back to the section that we read in the Napoleonic Wars, the British wars with France, he's going to echo a lot of what people like William Godwin were saying in that period. So I'm going to get a volunteer to read starting from Horrible Enough on page 41.
Horrible enough.
Thank you, Jesse.
A whole marked field strewed with shells, splinters, cannon shot, ruined tumbrils, and dead men and horses. Stragglers still remaining, not so much as buried, and those red mold heaped, there lie the shells of men, out of which all the life and virtue has been blown. And now are they swept together and crammed out out of sight like blown eggshells. Did nature, when she bade the now bring down his mold cargoes from the Carnathian and Carpathian heights and spread them out here into the softest, richest level, intend thee, O Marchfield, for a corn-bearing nursery wherein her children might be nursed, or for a cockpit wherein they might the more commodiously be throttled and tattered. Were thy three broad highways meeting here from the ends of Europe made for ammunition wagons then? Were thy wagrams and stilfrits but so many ready-built casemates wherein the house of Habsburg might batter with artillery and with artillery be battered?
Okay, you can stop there. I think that kind of makes the basic point here, right? So he's talking about this field in Central Europe that has been a battlefield since the 13th century, right? Lots of battles have been fought on this particular plain. What is he saying about it? What is he saying this thing's natural purpose is? Is it supposed to be a place where human beings come together and stab the life out of one another?
No.
Yeah, so like, did nature intend thee for, a cockpit where people are throttled, or a cornberry nursery, right? These highways that cross you, are they intended to move armies or to move trade wagons, right? So war is here described as a kind of waste of potential and a waste of energy, right? There's all of this vital energy in this field that gets trampled and destroyed when armies go to war. But this energy can't be stamped out either, if we look at the bottom of the paragraph, right? Nevertheless, nature is at work. Neither shall these powder devilkins with their utmost devilry gainsay her, but all that gore and carnage will be shrouded in, absorbed into manure, and next year the Marchfeld will be green, nay greener. Thrifty, unwearied nature, ever out of our great waste, educing some little profit of thy own. How dost thou from the very carcass of the killer bring life for the living? So all of these dead bodies that are strewn across this plain, right, they get reabsorbed. And the Marchfeld uses their energy and produces something new out of it, which then new armies will then come and trample and so on and so forth, right? But you get the idea, right? So energy for Carlyle within nature seems to be a kind of constant commodity, right? It's you can't destroy it; it just comes back. Now, can I get somebody to read from the top, from the beginning of the paragraph and page 42, what, speaking in quite unofficial language, is the net purport and upshot of war?
What, speaking in quite unofficial language, is the net purport and upshot of war? To my own knowledge, for example, there dwell employed in the British village of Dumbridge, usually from some 500 souls. From these, by natural enemies of the French, they are not successfully selected during the French War, say 30 able-bodied men. Dumbridge, at her own expense, has suckled and nursed them. She has not, without difficulty and sorrow, fed them up to manhood and even trained them to craft so that one can weave, another can build, another can hammer, and the weakest can stand up to 30 stones.
It's just a measure of weight.
Nevertheless, amid much weeping and swearing, they are all selected, all dressed in red, and shipped away at the public charges, some 2,000 miles away, or say only from the south of Spain, and fed there till morning. And now to that same spot in the south of Spain, there are 30 French artisans from Fritz Dumbridge, and like manner with wending, till the length after infinite effort, the two parties come into actual juxtaposition, and 30 stands fronting 30. Each with guns in his hand, straightway the word fire is given, and they blow souls out of one another. And in place of 60 brisk, useful craftsmen, the world has 60 dead carcasses, which is a must bury and a new shed of tears. Had these men any quarrel, busy as the devil is, not the smallest, they live far enough apart where the entirest of strangers, nay, in so wide universe, there were even unconsciously by commerce some mutual helpfulness between them. How then, simpleton, their governors had fallen out, and instead of shooting one another, had the cunning to make these poor blockheads shoot.
Okay, thank you. So this is a kind of lengthy scene that's drawn out here, right? But let's sort of like break down the elements of it, right? So what is Carlyle describing here, in the voice of Teufelsdruck? What happens in this? Yeah, so he's still talking about war, right? And this time he's talking about war as a waste of people rather than a waste of land, right? And a waste of money. So what happens in this British village of Dumbridge?
Some boys are sent away,
Mm-hmm.
and I think not separated, but they went to war,
Uh-huh.
and they're now together.
Yep. And the same thing happens from a French village that is similar in most respects to Dumdrudge, right? The village itself has spent time, energy, and resources feeding and raising these men to adulthood and training them in useful crafts, right? And all of that is wasted once they get to that battlefield and blow the lives out of each other, right? As Carlyle puts it. Right. Once the world does, the world, Dumdrudge, the world loses another soldier, but Dumdrudge loses a weaver. Dumdrudge loses a carpenter, right? Dumdrudge loses a basket maker, right? People who could do things that were useful. And why did these French village artisans and English village artisans kill each other?
Because they were ordered to by the government.
Yeah, exactly. Because, they had no quarrel with each other. They don't even know each other. But their governments had a disagreement. And so, these poor saps are the ones who have to pay the price for it, right? So, the picture that Carlyle is painting of war here is a colossal waste of life, of energy, and of money that disproportionately causes suffering for ordinary people rather than for elites, right? There's a class-based element to this too. But at the same time, one of Carlyle's biggest historical legacies is what comes to be called the great man theory of history. Carlyle's own politics are actually a little bit authoritarian. Have any of you ever heard of the great man theory? Does anybody know how this works? Okay, so the basic idea behind the great man theory is that history is moved forward, never backward, by extraordinary individuals. Right, so the idea, for example, that the American Revolution was primarily the work of Washington on the battlefield and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson through diplomacy, right? So these, this notion that it's these exceptional individuals, right, that drive history forward rather than ordinary people doing anything, right? This idea that the power of France in the early 19th century is solely focused on Napoleon, right? That the most important figures in Europe during World War II are Hitler, Churchill, and Stalin, right? That it's it's these leaders that matter. These people who are raised above the status of ordinary folk, who really drive history, and the great man theory tends to ignore what regular people are doing to aid and abet or to try to counter these historical currents, right? And Carlyle is the one who kind of invents this idea, or at least popularizes it in the Anglo-American consciousness. So to get a sense of how this is expressed here, if we look on page 44, it talks about Teufelsdrück's meeting with Napoleon. Right. Of Napoleon himself, we shall only, glancing from afar, remark that Teufelsdrück's relation to him seems to have been of very varied character. At first we find our poor professor on the point of being shot as a spy, then taken into private conversation, even pinched on the ear, yet presented with no money. At last, indignantly dismissed, almost thrown out of doors as an ideologist. He himself, says the professor, was among the completest ideologists, at least idiopraxists, in the idea. He lived, moved, and fought. The man was a divine missionary, though unconscious of it, and preached through the cannon's throat that great doctrine, the tools to him that can handle them, which is our ultimate political evangel, wherein alone liberty lie. Madly enough he preached, it is true, as enthusiasts and first missionaries are wont, with the imperfect utterance amid much frothy rant, yet as articulately perhaps as the case admitted. Or call him, if you will, an American backwoodsman, who had to fell unpenetrated forests and battle with innumerable wolves, and did not entirely forbear strong liquor, rioting, and even theft, whom, notwithstanding, the peaceful sower will follow, as he cuts the boundless harvest, bless. So, what he means here by Napoleon as an ideologist or an idiopraxis, right? Somebody who puts an idea into practice, is that Napoleon is, like all of Carlyle's great men, animated by a particular controlling idea for which he is willing to do just about anything, right? This is the thing that distinguishes, for Carlyle, the great man from the ordinary person, right? This devotion to working out an idea in practice. And that while Napoleon might be cutting a bloody swath across Europe at one point, at another point, peaceful farms and villages will spring up in the wake of that war, right? Once all the old dead wood is cleared away. So these people who are animated by these big ideas end up creating the conditions for peace and the conditions for more satisfactory human life, right? Now, most historians today would say that Carlyle is completely fucking wrong, right? That this is not actually how history works or how history moves. But this becomes a really popular and influential idea, and we're going to see this in practice in Tennyson's King Arthur poems that we're going to look at next time, right? Tennyson's picture of King Arthur is heavily influenced by Carlyle and by the great man idea. And so Arthur's success and failure are both going to be traceable back to currents we see in Carlyle. All right, so does anybody have any questions? Everybody good? Do we feel like we understand what's going on here a little bit better? Okay, good. All right, if I left you feeling more confused, then that would probably be bad. Okay, so I'll send you the reading questions for Tennyson this afternoon. We will, you'll work on those proposals. You will email me any questions you have about the proposals as you're working, and I'll see you next week.